Hey everybody, I'm Logan Alec. I'm a CPA. Own Choice Tax Relief. Today I'm going to be talking about the new draft of the W-2 form that the IRS released to take into account changes enacted by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And what might those changes be that affect employees? Well, the first one is the no tax on tips provision, which isn't really no tax on tips. It's just an up to $25,000 deduction for qualifying tips. Okay, and that deduction starts to phase out once your modified adjusted gross income exceeds $150,000 or $300,000 if you're married filing jointly. And then also no tax on overtime, which again isn't really no tax on overtime. It's a deduction of up to $12,500 or $25,000 for married filing jointly on qualifying overtime pay. And our understanding of the rule right now is that on the time and a half you make for overtime, it's only the half portion that qualifies for the deduction, right? So hope that makes sense. But the issue here is, when this kind of first came out and people were talking about it, it's like, well, do I as an employee have to keep track of this stuff, or is my employer going to keep track of it and issue it to me on a W-2? And the law is clear. These amounts need to be indicated on the tax form on the W-2. So naturally the IRS has had to make changes to the standard W-2 form to account for these things, right? So that employees know, well, what's my qualifying overtime that qualifies for deduction potentially? What are my qualifying tips, right? Things like that. Now, disappointingly enough, or maybe the opposite, maybe not disappointingly, the IRS has, we'll talk about the W-2 in a bit, but the IRS announced at the beginning of this month that they're not going to change individual information returns, just like W-2s, or the withholding tables for 2025 under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, right? So that means there's not going to be a new W-2 for 2025, okay? So that's kind of a bummer. And so right now we're still trying to figure out, well, okay, for 2025, how are employees going to know what their qualifying tips amount are or what their, overtime? You could look at the last pay stub, right, and kind of maybe figure some of that out, the year-to-date stuff, right, for your, last pay stub of the year or whatever, right? Hopefully it has the tips broken out there. The overtime though, I know in most pay stubs, it's going to show you the entire overtime paid during the year without distinction between the time and the half, right? If you see what I'm saying, which you could probably back into it pretty easily unless you got a pay raise in the middle of the year, in which case, you might have to go pay stub by pay stub to figure that out, right? And that's the headache that the IRS doesn't want. Everyday employees who have a pretty straightforward return because they just have a W-2 they do in TurboTax, they don't want to put that administrative burden on them. They'd rather that administrative burden be borne by the employers to correctly report that information on the W-2. So it's kind of a bummer that for 2025, we're not going to see a new W-2. We're going to have to see how this works out. Employees may just have to get this information directly from their employers, but we still have a few months here until January 2026 when employees are going to start to need this information to do their tax return. But starting in tax year 2026 is when the IRS is going to roll out the new W-2 to account for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act changes. Okay, and so this is W-2s for 2026 that are issued to employees in January 2027. Okay, so these are the way, just to be completely clear, this new W-2 is rolling out. It's going to be starting to be issued in January 2027, at least according to current IRS plans. All right, so it's for wages earned in 2026. But just so you're ahead of the game and aware of what we're going to be looking at, let's talk about it. First thing I noticed that's different here on the W-2 is this box 14B. Okay, Treasury tipped occupation code. Actually, let's get an old W-2 up here. Not old, just what we're working with today. So for 2025, right? So this is what employees are going to get in January 2026. Box 14 is just kind of some other box here in California. You'll see the California SDI, which is the state disability insurance fund that employees have to pay into. Your state probably has something similar, right? So box 14 is kind of a box for other, right? Well, the new W-2, you're going to have 14A for other, but 14B is going to have the Treasury tipped occupation code. What is that? Well, in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the law said that qualifying tips are only qualifying if they're paid in an occupation that regularly and typically receives tipped income, right? And the Treasury Department, the law said that within 90 days of the enactment of the law, so the law was enacted on July 4th, so that's early October. IRS is probably going to give the Treasury is probably going to give itself an extension, but the Treasury has to come out and give a list of all the occupation codes that that meet that definition of an occupation in which workers typically get tips, right? We know what these are. Restaurants, cosmetic type stuff, hairstylists, stuff like that, right? Because what the IRS doesn't want is to now incentivize a bunch of industries where tipping is not typical, right? To then now start collecting tips and say, well, this is tips and, this is now a deduction. It doesn't want to kind of create some weird new tipping culture, right? Beyond the current service industries in which there currently does exist a tipping culture. So it's going to come out with a list of the occupations that qualify, and that occupation code, however they might use the NAICS codes, they might use the codes that are currently used on Schedule C for things. We're going to have to see, right? Because obviously Schedule C codes and, the codes you put on a business return, those are for, businesses. There would be separate codes for employees, right? Because there's not a complete match between codes used for a small business versus codes used for workers in that business. But anyway, so they're gonna have to come up with that, and it's gonna be indicated here. The employer's gonna have to keep record of what that code is for each employee and indicate it to them on their W-2. Okay. If you look at the rest of the page one here, there's not much that changes about the face of it, but where there are some changes is in box 12. And if you know about box 12 on the W-2, it's kind of where everything in the kitchen sink goes in. There's a bunch of codes, for box 12, talking about, everything, right? There's a bunch of codes about kind of random stuff. I mean, the big ones are, the health insurance premiums your employer paid on your behalf, the amount you contributed to a 401k, stuff like that. But the new codes for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, well, the first one is employer contributions to your Trump account. Now, just briefly, I didn't make a video about Trump accounts, but the Trump accounts are the new accounts for children that you can contribute up to $5,000 a year for, right? And it kind of functions like an IRA of sorts. And I think for babies born between 2025 and 2028, the government will just deposit $1,000 in a Trump account. But employers, if they want to add this as a benefit, can contribute up to $2,500 to an employee's Trump account, the employee is under the age of 18, or to a Trump account on behalf of an employee's child, if the employee has a child under the age of 18. Okay, so, and that's when we're looking at the W-2 here. Let me get back to that screen. The employer contribution to the Trump account would be indicated with code TA in box 12. Okay, so you'd say, like, if they did the full 2,500, you'd see, 2,500. All right, moving right along here. Another new box 12 code. Total amount of qualifying tips, right? Let's talk about this in a second. But so the employer's gonna have to calculate for you what are your qualified tips for the year that you can take. I guess the $25,000 tip deduction, right? And so that would be, here, maybe you made 10,000 or something in qualifying tips. I don't know. And then TT here, total amount of qualified overtime compensation, right? So the employer's gonna have to tell you this is how much you can deduct, potentially, subject to income limitations and all that, right? So, yep, these are the new codes for the new employee impacted aspects of the Form W-2. Now, side note here, it looks like we're going to get a new schedule, Schedule 1A, and my inkling is, this is a 2024 1040, it's the latest we got, but my inkling is because we have so many. I need to show you the actual tax return, because we got so many new deductions that are below the line, so they don't affect AGI, but they do affect taxable income, and they're not itemized deductions, right? So in that sense, they're similar to the QBI deduction, right? Which for 2024 is the only thing like this, the only deduction like this, right? It's something that affects it's a deduction that affects taxable income, but not AGI, and it's not an itemized deduction or the standard deduction, right? My inkling is because we have so many more of these things, like the no tax on tips, or the tip deduction, the overtime deduction, the $6,000 senior deduction, right? That are this that would go in the same place as the tax return as QBI. It seems that it's these deductions that are now going to be reported on Schedule 1A. And my hunch is that just like we have, things like adjustments to income from Schedule 1, line 26, we're going to see something like, here between AGI and taxable income that says, adjustments to income from Schedule 1A, right? Or deductions from income from Schedule 1A, right? Which is referenced here. Treasury, IRS has not yet released a draft of what that Schedule 1A might look like. So anyway, all right. That's the one big, beautiful W-2. Not much different. We got a Box 14B and some new Box 12 codes. What's more interesting potentially is that new Schedule 1A. That when I see a draft of it from Treasury, I'll be sure to make a video about it and share my thoughts. Anyway, folks, thanks so much for watching this video. I have some other videos here about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act on the left-hand side of the screen for your education and enjoyment. And, of course, I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.